Good evening. My name is Rick Clear. I'm Dean of the Faculty of Arts here. I'm going to be introducing the Woodrow Lloyd Lecture Series tonight. We have a few people without seats. If you have a spare seat next to you, could you maybe just put up your hand so that we can seat the few who are still looking for a place? Thank you. I want to welcome you all here to the University of Regina campus, which is on Treaty 4 land, and also to the 2018 Woodrow Lloyd Lecture. Just like to take a moment to introduce a few special guests. First of all, Chief Edmund Bellegarde from the Files Hills Qu'Appelle Tribal Council, back there. Welcome. Dr. Tom Chase, Provost and Vice President Academic here at the University of Regina. And Dr. Bob Casius, Vice President Academic at First Nations University of Canada. My apologies if I've missed anyone else. My grasp of faces and names is growing weaker with every passing year. Each winter, through the generous support of the Woodrow Lloyd Trust, the University of Regina Faculty of Arts presents an annual lecture in honor of the late Woodrow Stanley Lloyd, 1913 to 1972, one of Saskatchewan's most influential public servants and most prominent education advocates. Lloyd believed that all students deserved equal access to educational opportunities and resources. As Minister of Education under the government of Tommy Douglas, he undertook a radical and at the time controversial redevelopment of Saskatchewan's education system, which included Canada's first system of student loans and bursaries, a system that would soon be implemented in provinces across the country. In 1961, Lloyd succeeded Tommy Douglas to serve as the 8th Premier of Saskatchewan, wherein he played a formative role in the implementation of Medicare, Canada's first public health care program. The Woodrow Lloyd Lecture Series was established at the University of Regina in recognition of his leadership and his legacy in the areas of education and public service. Its terms of reference call for a nationally or internationally recognized scholar, writer, thinker, or activist to deliver an annual public lecture on an issue of direct relevance to Saskatchewan. At this moment, and in this province, no issue could be more urgent or of direct relevance than that of reconciliation. 2 years ago, the Honorable Justice Murray Sinclair, Chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, delivered the 2016 Woodrow Lloyd Lecture in this very room. He discussed the historical injustices of Canada's residential school system and the ongoing legacy of harm that structural racism continues to wage against Indigenous peoples. He discussed the Commission's 94 calls to action, recommendations on how all Canadians might help to heal the relationship in this country between Western settlers and Indigenous peoples. 2 years later, a trial in Battleford has exposed how inadequate our approach to reconciliation has been. On behalf of the Faculty of Arts, I want to express our unconditional support to those who are struggling to make sense of the death of Colton Boushie and the seeming indifference of our justice system. We recognize the great pain that this verdict has inflicted upon the Indigenous peoples residing in Saskatchewan, including upon colleagues and students here at the University of Regina. Tonight, I want to acknowledge publicly what those people already know, that we have a long, long way to go yet on the road to meaningful reconciliation. I would now like to welcome Dr. Nilgun Under, Associate Professor and Associate Dean of the Faculty of Arts, to introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to introduce tonight's lecturer, Dr. Pam Palmater. No doubt many of you are familiar with her tireless work representing Indigenous rights issues in the media, in scholarship, and in the policy sphere. Pam Palmater is a Mi'kmaq lawyer, author, and social justice activist from the Eel River Bar First Nation in New Brunswick. She has been a prominent advocate for the rights of Indigenous peoples and communities for over 25 years, acting in the areas of poverty, housing, education, Aboriginal and treaty rights and legislation. She is frequently called upon as an expert before parliamentary and United Nations committees to discuss laws, policies, and the rights of Indigenous peoples. She has likewise worked as a human rights investigator at the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission and worked collaboratively with organizations such as the Canadian Human Rights Commission and Amnesty International. Much of her recent work has been in the areas of missing and murdered Indigenous women and sexualized violence in policing. Dr. Palmater holds 4 university degrees, including a Bachelor of Arts from St. Thomas University with a double major in History and Native Studies, a Bachelor of Laws from the University of New Brunswick, and master's and doctoral degrees in law from Dalhousie University, specializing in Indigenous law. She currently holds the chair in Indigenous governance at Ryerson University and is an associate professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration. Dr. Palmater has been recognized with many awards for her social justice and human rights advocacy, including, but not limited to, the WYCA Women of Distinction Award in Social Justice, Canadian Lawyer Magazine's top 5 most influential lawyers in the human rights category, the Margaret Mead Award in Social Justice, the J.S. Woodsworth Woman of Excellence Award in Human Rights, and Honorary Doctorate of Laws from the University of New Brunswick. Tonight, we welcome Dr. Palmater's insights into the difficult political and economic work that must take place in order to achieve true reconciliation. Her observations come at a time we can only hope might be a historical turning point in the relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples. Please welcome Dr. Pam Palmater.
Kwe, Nin Deluizi Pam Palmater. I'm from the sovereign Mi'kmaq Nation on unceded Mi'kmaqi territory on the eastern part of Turtle Island, and it's an honor to be here on Indigenous lands. And I am full realization that I am a guest here on lands that have been held by Indigenous nations here, sovereign, strong, proud Indigenous nations since time immemorial. And I take this opportunity and consider this opportunity with the huge responsibility that comes with it. I don't purport to speak for any Indigenous peoples that live here. I'm speaking on behalf of myself. I'm speaking my truth and talking about the hard things that sometimes we don't like to talk about. And I want to first thank the Indigenous community groups that met with me before this event and gave me this t-shirt in honor of the work that we're all doing to try to bring justice for Indigenous peoples. And the Aboriginal students that were here, and all of the really good and inspiring work that they're doing, and of course to the Woodrow Committee and the University of Regina senior administration and staff and faculty and students who have provided me with this opportunity. And I want to particularly note that you're providing this opportunity to an Indigenous woman. And it's not frequent that Indigenous women are empowered to engage in national dialogue, political dialogue, and hard legal dialogue. And so that's also a credit to your university. Thank you. I also want to thank all of you, all the chiefs, counselors, community members, staff, faculty, friends, allies, family members, cousins, second cousins, third cousins, all my bros that are here, because this is a sign that we are moving in the right direction, that we can literally fill this auditorium with people who are interested and care about social justice in this country, justice for everybody, and that's important. So please keep in mind, even though some of the messages that I'm going to deliver here tonight are going to be difficult, there's always hope at the end. And you being here and engaging in these really difficult conversations is what has to happen. And I think we've really avoided the difficult stuff for far too long. But before that, I want to make sure that we also acknowledge the courage and strength and resilience and hope that the family and community of Colton Bushy has inspired us all. Rallies, marches, and vigils happened all across the country because we were inspired by their strength. And I think that says a lot about Indigenous peoples and this family. I'm so sorry for their tremendous loss and fully support them in all of their calls for appeals, inquiries, inquests, whatever it is that they need. I think we should all support them at this time. At the same time, I think it's also important to acknowledge the families and communities of Neil Stonechild, Leo Lachance, William Kakakaway, Leonard Paul John, Haven Dubois, and other people like Nadine Michiznik, sorry, I probably got that wrong, Shelley Napope, Melanie Dawn Geddes, Amber Redman, and Danita Big Eagle. This isn't the first time this has happened in Saskatchewan. It's gotten a lot of media attention, and we're all talking about it, and that's important. But this room is probably filled with lots of families who have never received justice. So it's important to remember that Colton Bushy has a lot of brothers and sisters across this country who suffered the very same fate. And it's for this reason, and for the literally thousands of other Indigenous men, women, and children who have suffered the same fate, that we have to have this conversation. Because it's not just serial killers, it's not just random monsters or predators, it's everyday society. These acts are committed, unfortunately, by police officers, doctors, lawyers, judges, teachers, your next door neighbor. This is the part about reconciliation that is probably the most difficult. But it's the part of the conversation that we have to have. Because the issue in the Colton Bushy case isn't with jury selection. The racism started when he died to begin with. And that's where we have to start. We have to prevent it there. If we're already at jury stage, then the conversation about reconciliation is too late. So we have to move this whole conversation forward and really look at, celebrate the good segments of our society and use all of that goodness and partnership and treaty relations to work together to expose the darker segments of society and make sure that none of us suffer these fates in the future. And that's why this conversation is so important, because so far, the problem as I see it is the conversation has only been around reconciliation. And there's a lot of misunderstanding around what is reconciliation. And we need to have a serious talk around whether reconciliation, as it's currently defined, as it's currently promoted, as currently used by governments and organizations, is that really what we're talking about? Is that really what's going to bring about substantive change? Because anything less than a radical departure from what's happening now, anything less isn't going to cut it. You simply can't tweak it around the edges. We've tried that. We've been doing that for decades. So my apologies if some of this is difficult, but I have to push you. It's my job. I have to do this for our future generations, because if we don't talk straight, we won't get to the real issues. But if you stick with me until the end, or I can just get them to lock the doors. It's your choice. I promise it gets better in the end, because every story gets better in the end. Our story will always get better in the end. So reconciliation, as I see it, really should be like an apology. Not the kind of apologies that we think about today, not those well-crafted apologies by lawyers where you don't really admit to doing anything and you're sorry that the other person took offense. I'm talking about the old school apologies that most of us grew up with. The kind that our parents and our kookums and our grandfathers forced us to do as kids. A real apology that's not court mandated, it's not imposed by litigation, and it's certainly not written by a PR firm. I mean the kind of apology that your grandmother forced you to give when you hurt somebody else. So when you were a kid, if you were on a playground and you went up to someone and kicked them in the shins, stole their lunch and ate it because they had a better lunch than you, oh my goodness, when your parents or grandparents found out about that, didn't they march you to the school the very next day and force you to address the wrong that you harmed, the wrong that you did? And the apology wasn't just a word, it was a series of actions. The first thing you had to do was admit to the child what you did. I kicked you, and I stole your lunch, and you went without. I admit that, and I take responsibility for that. Because if you can't start there, the rest really doesn't mean anything. Anytime I ever tried to say, sorry, I got kicked in the butt. It had to be real. The other thing you had to do is listen to the child that you hurt. Listen to what that child has to say about how you hurt them and in what ways and how it's been lasting. You don't get to argue with them and say, well, that's not true. I didn't do that and I didn't mean this. And you don't get to judge the harm when you inflict it. Then you have to accept that harm as fact. You don't get to debate it later. You don't get to analyze it later. It's fact. Only then do you get to move to the I'm sorry stage. But it's not even over then. Because when you apologize for what you did and the harm that was caused, you have to make a very critical promise. And that is, I won't ever do that again. I'm sorry, I won't ever do that again. I'm aware of the harm I caused, and I won't do that again. And it's still not over then, because the most critical part of that apology is you have to make amends. You have to give that child a replacement lunch, maybe one even better than your own with Cookum's Bannock or something. And maybe you have to assist that child going to and from class because you hurt him so bad he can't walk on his foot anymore. And then you maintain an ongoing relationship because you're brothers now. That's what an apology is. That's the kind of apology I grew up with. That's what reconciliation should be. And if you judge reconciliation by just those basics, we are nowhere near reconciliation. Because the problem, like I said, is that we're only talking about reconciliation. But we can't even begin to start that process unless we talk about truth, justice, and then reconciliation. Because don't forget, the Truth and Reconciliation Report was first and foremost about gathering the truth, gathering the facts, and making sure everyone knew not only what happened, but the harm it caused. That's an important part. And here's the thing about the Truth and Reconciliation Report. That's but one chapter of many in this book of truth on our relationship here in this country. That's just one chapter. And while it might be easier, or it might be more efficient, or it might feel better to just skip over the truth and justice part and just skip right to the feel-good reconciliation part, then we're never going to fix anything. So many governments and organizations, many with great intentions, have rushed to things like land acknowledgements. And land acknowledgements are important because we should be respected in the territory that is ours. Many have rushed to just hanging Native art in their boardrooms and corporate offices. That's important. We should be reflected. Native people should see themselves reflected everywhere. Renaming buildings so that those who committed genocide against us aren't memorialized or in our faces every day. Equally important. However, they haven't addressed what needs to be reconciled. That doesn't get our people out of prison or our kids out of care. It doesn't get our lands back. And when we're talking about reconciliation, it is not just the symbolism. We have to get at the actual harms. So first, the very first step is we actually need to get to the truth. And like I said, we've just barely scratched the surface. We must continue to re-educate Canadians. Even in some circumstances, uneducate Canadians from what they learned about us and our history, or what wasn't written in the history books, or in the current books, because in fact, we're still here. This isn't a project about looking back about Native people who used to exist in the past. We're talking about right here and right now. And we have to, at the same time, address willful blindness. Oftentimes I will hear the excuse, well, Canadians don't know. But if you look at the statistics and all of the surveys that have been done, the vast majority of Canadians can tell you many First Nations live in horrific, horrendous, abject poverty. The majority of Canadians know there's a land issue, there's a treaty issue, there's a self-determination issue. And the majority of Canadians know there is a justice issue. Well, we've only had many justice reports to talk about it, so we know these things. So it can't just be about education. It also has to be about action. But we need those facts because, I admit, not all Canadians know all the facts. We're now in a place where I think many Canadians know about residential schools, but they don't necessarily know everything else that happened. Not everything that's happened in this country was well-intentioned. Not everything that happens in this country today is unintentional or a mistake. We can address the systemic issues. We can address the laws that were meant to be neutral but have a disproportionate effect. But we tend to avoid that really uncomfortable R word, and it's called racism. You know, and not everybody feels that way. But there's enough in society that it poses a significant danger to our health and well-being as Indigenous peoples. And that's part of the truth that we have to get at. But there's really two parts to this truth that we need to talk about. And the first one really is the happy truth, the good truth that also isn't shared with Canadians. The fact that Indigenous peoples come from strong, proud, diverse, resilient, amazing Indigenous nations. The fact that we come from complex economies, governing structures, laws, trading networks, intertribal treaty negotiations. Our people are beautiful. The ways of our people are beautiful. That's a truth that needs to be shared. We have been guided and grounded by our ceremonies since time immemorial. In many instances, that's the only thing that kept us alive. That's the only thing that gave us hope to go forward. We are literally nourished, mind, body, and spirit, by the collective strength, closeness, love, and humor of our communities. In all the many ways that we're so imperfect and we're so impacted by colonization, there's no other place I would rather be than amongst these communities. Our identities, cultures, and languages are inherently connected to the land. You know the best place to fish by the name of the river. You know where not to go hunting in someone else's territory by the name of a specific location. You know how to cure illnesses and diseases and stay healthy by the names of plants. That's how important we are. That's how much we have to offer. And here's the other thing that you don't get to see, and it's a really happy truth, that our ancestors are always walking with us while we create this path for our future generations. They're always with us. And that's a form of strength that we need to share and celebrate. We're impacted, we're affected, we're angry, we're sad, we're hurt. But Indigenous peoples have never given up hope. No matter what has happened to us, no matter what anyone has done to us, the first thing we always do is extend our hand and say, we just want to work with you. We just want to work with you. It didn't have to be that way, but we signed treaties to work together. We've lived up to our treaty obligations. Part of reconciliation, part of the truth is talking about those treaty obligations. But in addition to this happy truth that has to be shared, there's also a really sad and hard truth. And that is that what Canada has done to us is genocide. And that's not theory, that's not political rhetoric, that's not my personal rant, that is a fact. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission considered Canada's history and said not only is it guilty of cultural genocide, but it is also guilty of physical and biological genocide. And I would welcome anyone in this auditorium to look at the United Nations definition on genocide. And just as a layperson, look and see if Canada meets any of those criteria. Unfortunately, Canada met all of them. But we haven't had that conversation. The truth is that colonial governments used every means necessary to take our lands and resources. It wasn't just assimilation. This wasn't just a cultural project of trying to incorporate Native people into the body politic. They also had a policy of elimination. And that's part of the discussion that starts to get really difficult because it is a shared legacy, whether you have been here for 4 generations or 4 days. Because everyone benefits from how we got here. So that's why we have to have this conversation. We need to talk about how even after Mi'kmaq peoples signed peace and friendship treaties, the colonial governments issued scalping bounties on our heads to take the rest of our lands away from us. After signing peace and friendship treaties. When you hear people say we're all treaty people, it has a very different meaning for different parts of the country. And we need to know that history. In my area, in Mi'kmaq, in eastern part of what's now called Canada, our young girls were kidnapped, tied up, and loaded onto settler boats. And they were the first example of human sex trafficking on this continent. Here's the really offensive thing about that. In my area, there's something called Heritage Days, and they celebrate and commemorate this history with paintings and reenactments of this happening. You want to talk about truth? Well, we need to address things like that. Because while there may be Native artwork in some of your boardrooms, in other parts of the country, they're still celebrating the things that happened to us. Police forces in this country, police forces, together with Indian agents, cleared the plains for settlement with a policy of starvation that involved withholding rations and impoverishing entire communities for decades at a time. Those same police forces and Indian agents used food rations to extort sex from Indigenous women and girls. You want to talk about when did murdered and missing Indigenous women and sex trafficking start? It started at settlement. This is not a recent phenomenon. Governments, aided by police forces, stole our children and forced them into residential schools, where we all know they were physically and sexually abused, subjected to medical experimentation, torture, and many ultimately died. Even when they were closing down those schools, many of our Indigenous women and girls were forcibly sterilized against their knowledge and consent. In some communities, it reduced the childbearing population by upwards of 40%. That's the kind of history that we need to talk about. People my age have been sterilized. It is just by some luck of the universe that that didn't happen to me, or it didn't happen to my sister. The things that happen in our society are like landmines that Indigenous people have to avoid just to survive. Even Indian hospitals, where the sickest and the most injured were sent, were rampant with physical and sexual abuse. This wasn't just a residential school issue. It happened in mental institutions, it happened in prisons, it happened in every agency of the government. Indian Affairs literally legislated more than 20,000 Indigenous women and kids out of the Indian Act to sever their ties with their communities forever. Unfortunately, today, Indigenous women and kids are still discriminated in the Indian Act. You would think that would be a quick fix for a government whose relationship no more important than the one with Indigenous peoples. There are easy things to do. Not everything has to be difficult. The 60s scoop, where social workers literally stole our children by the busloads and farmed them out to white families, is still happening. They're calling it the 60s scoop, but it started in the 1950s when they started to shut down the residential schools, and now it's worse than during the 60s scoop or residential schools. So when people tell me, why don't you just get over it? Okay, stop doing it. Literally, stop doing it and I'll get over it. We know prisons are the new residential schools. Our lands were stolen and in many cases have never been returned. Our treaty rights have been violated more than honored. And here's the really problematic part. So in addition to all of that, Indigenous peoples and our identity has been criminalized by colonial and now modern governments. And that has fed the minds, hearts, and souls of settlers. That has charted the public discourse to make us all look like savages, heathens, dangerous, criminals, terrorists that deserve what we get. And that's what Canada has done to everybody in this room. That's the truth part of getting out of this business. How is it that simply being born Mi'kmaq justifies the death penalty through scalping? How is that? possible. We literally, throughout our entire lifetimes, even today, have to be what I call criminally indigenous. And I don't mean we have to be criminals. I mean, in order for us to maintain our indigeneity, we have to break Canada's laws. We've been doing it since contact. Our traditional mode of subsistence, hunting, fishing, trapping, gathering, trading, that was all regulated and criminalized by the federal and provincial governments. You could go to jail, you could lose your equipment, you could have your gun seized. We literally had to sneak around the woods like criminals, breaking Canadian law to feed our families. It was against the law not to send our kids to residential schools. So every time a mom who ran into the woods and hid her kids in the bush to save them from the Indian agent, she was being a criminal. Our very survival is against the law. Every time we defend our lands and waters peacefully and without violence, we're arrested, charged, sometimes beaten, sometimes murdered. We know that there's many people in prison. That's the kind of truth that we need to talk about. And if it wasn't for the fact that we have literally had multiple generations of the criminalization of our people and feeding this to Canadian citizens, we wouldn't be where we are today. We would be able to look around and say, well, that's ridiculous. But there are still people in this country, clearly, recent events have shown, that believe that their property is more important than the life of an Indigenous person. The Department of National Defense's manual refers to Indigenous groups who advocate for self-determination or protect their lands as insurgents and radicals, domestic terrorists. We actually had a Minister of Indian Affairs who stood up in Parliament and called the treaty chiefs here in Saskatchewan and Manitoba and Alberta rogue chiefs and threats to national security. What kind of message does this send to the public? Except to make the darker segments of public feel justified in the actions that they take against Indigenous peoples. And when there's no follow-up by police officers who also believe we deserve what we get, then what happens and what has been created in this country is almost complete impunity for violence, rape, and murder against Indigenous peoples. Do you know it's so bad? The conviction rate for violence against Indigenous peoples is so low. When we were before the United Nations and they pressed Canada on how they know all the stats of how many are dead and missing, how many convictions they had, they couldn't come up with a single percentage. What does that say? Well, that's probably the reason why Indigenous women are 7 times more likely to be targeted by serial killers. Why? Because they can. There's a 0% conviction rate for human sex traffickers. And the number one target? Indigenous women and girls. More than 40% of those who are trafficked are Indigenous women and girls. We have got to stop this. We have got to address this truth. Colton Bushy was killed by a farmer who felt that his property was more important than that Indigenous life. Tina Fontaine was killed by a sexual predator who was trying to protect the property that he stole from someone else to stop her from telling the police. Canada has been created on a very problematic foundation of us versus them, the good guys versus the criminals. And that's simply not the case. It is embedded, unfortunately, in the attitudes, laws, policies, governments, and decision-making, and entire structures of this country. So making a few amendments to the criminal code or court procedures, that's not going to cut it. Even if you address the jury issue tomorrow, that doesn't stop people like Colton Bushy from being murdered in the first place. We have to go back to the beginning. It's time to shine a light on all of these dark places that we don't want to look at. We don't want to look at the link between foster care and the human trafficking and child porn rings. We don't want to look at the link between the extractive industry and violence against women and murdered and missing Indigenous women. We don't want to look at the rates of police corruption and sexualized violence. We don't want to look at those things, but we have to if we're going to move forward. We have to literally decolonize the hearts and minds of our neighbors, our friends, our family members, our moms and dads, brothers, sisters, husbands, and wives. Or we don't get to call ourselves a democratic country. We don't get to call ourselves a human rights respecting country. We'll be no different than the other countries that Canada points at and says, shame on them for those human rights abuses. Glad we don't do that. Like the TRC has called, all of these facts, the truth part of reconciliation, needs to be taught, not just in the history books, but in all the books. The media needs to know the history and the context and the facts before even talking about our stories. And Indigenous people shouldn't have to carry the burden of educating everybody. There is a role for our allies to play. Because when I'm talking about colonization, when I'm talking about the truth of what's happened, you can literally do it by the numbers too. In case you think this is just my opinion, Indigenous people are only 5% of the population, but they're almost half of all of them in foster care. In places like Manitoba, it's more than 90%. One baby is stolen from a mom in a Manitoba hospital every single day. The rates are pretty scary in Saskatchewan. The leading cause of death for Indigenous youth is suicide. And suicide is a lack of hope. We owe our kids more than that. 60% of all First Nations kids live in poverty, but in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, it's a lot higher. Our life expectancy is 15 years less. More than 25% of all federal prisoners are Indigenous men. 36% are Indigenous women. And the fastest growing prison population is Indigenous girls. They're the biggest intake in all of the correctional facilities. So that's the truth. What do you do with that? You still can't run to reconciliation. Because before reconciliation and all the feel-good stuff, then comes justice. And justice is very concrete. It's action-based, it's not words, it's not apologies. It means stop doing the things that hurt us. Stop, full stop. Not next week, not after the next election, not once you negotiate a self-government agreement, not if you agree to sign this land claim. You stop it now. You will hear politicians say, well, you know, this stuff can't happen overnight. Yes, it can. It can. Tomorrow, I want no more Indigenous children taken from a First Nation family or community ever again. And the provinces might think that that will create a crisis. Excellent. Set up an emergency management crisis team, set up a budget, and you send in whatever people, programs, and infrastructure you need to support that family and community to keep that child. We should also do away with mandatory minimum sentences and replace it with mandatory non-sentences for all nonviolent crimes. If you steal a chocolate bar or you break into a store to steal food for your family, you don't have to go to prison for the rest of your life, be locked up in solitary, and die in custody. A mandatory non-sentence means Canada has to right now come up with all the people, infrastructure, supports, and funding to make sure that that person has all of the supports they need to address the issue to begin with, to make sure they get to stay as adults in their community and not in the residential schools called prison. Oh, and the easiest one to do is get rid of gender discrimination in the Indian Act. They had an opportunity to do this. But they told us, just wait, we want to do another round of consultations. We want to see if the men will agree. Well, I don't give two Fs if the men agree. It is the law in this country, gender equality, and in fact, it's Indigenous law. Why on earth would we allow this to happen? Something that could be changed tomorrow. I mean, apparently, Trudeau has a whole suite of legislation to recognize Indigenous rights, and just not that for women. These are the things that we have to call them on. Canada has a lot of work to do, and justice, which has to come before reconciliation, won't happen with tinkering with laws or procedures. It won't happen by hiring a few Native people on the police force. It won't happen by having a Native Assistant Deputy Minister of the Environment. You can't tokenize your way out of justice. Canada must end impunity for violence against our peoples. It's as simple as that. No more killers, rapists, sex traffickers, or child porn rings get to walk free anymore. Real justice for Indigenous peoples means that Canada is going to have to root out white supremacist groups, hate groups, anti-women groups, anti-multiculturalism groups, pro-violence groups, and deal with these problems that they created. This has been created, now the responsibility, you must deal with it. And while they're at it, maybe they could give some of our lands and resources back. The next land acknowledgement I want to hear out of a senator, MP, or minister's mouth is, I'm standing on the unceded territory of Mi'kma'ki, and we've just given back 1,000 hectares. That's the kind of land acknowledgement that you give. And compensate people for the harms that have been caused. Stop litigating and address all of these issues. This is a monumental undertaking, and I am not trying to act like this is so simple and so easy. It's not. No one said this is going to be an easy process. This is hard. Colonization of Indigenous peoples' lands and bodies was violent and lethal for hundreds of years. Reconciliation is probably going to be a little uncomfortable. And that's part of it. Truth, justice, and then reconciliation. Reconciliation is about reparation. Because I'm here to say, if it feels good, it is not reconciliation. If you went to a powwow and sampled Bannock and feel good about yourself, that is not reconciliation. If you watched a documentary and feel like you know more, that's not reconciliation. You may have a best friend who's a Native. That, in fact, is also not reconciliation. Reconciliation, where we get to have all of these mutually beneficial partnerships, celebrate in festivals, commemorize, indigenize, feel good about one another and lift each other up, that comes after truth and justice. In practical terms, that means with land acknowledgements come land. When you put Native artwork on Canadian currency, give us the Canadian currency. But there's also very significant things, because there's a lot of problematic recommendations going around. Instead of bringing culture and ceremony into prisons, bring our people out of prisons. And listen, I'm not saying it's one or the other, the symbolism or the substantive. What I'm saying is you can't have one without the other. You can't just do symbolism without the substantive, or you're not there. You're not at reconciliation. But here's the thing, we can do this. We can, we're here. This whole room is filled with allies. Community members, friends and neighbors who have stood by Native people during Idle No More, at Colton Bushy rallies, vigils for murdered and missing Indigenous women. There are people in this room who have written 1,000 letters to MPs and senators. There are people who have donated to legal funds. There is lots that we can do. We have the power to make these changes, and we have the foundation for moving forward. We don't need any new federal ideas. We have the spirit and intent of the treaties, and they say mutual respect, mutual benefit, and mutual protection. And what we're saying now, treaty partners, is time to rise up and protect your treaty partner. But here's the thing, and it's going to be hard. Many of us are conflict adverse. Nothing that we have ever achieved in the history of humanity, none of our greatest accomplishments around women's rights, human rights, Indigenous rights, have come without conflict. Conflict is coming. We get to choose how we manage that. We get to choose how we channel that conflict into constructive changes. We can't avoid the conflict. We have to deal with the difficulty. But reconciliation requires the discomfort that comes with transferring land, power, and wealth back to Indigenous peoples. There's no way around it. There is no other solution. There is no other box you get to check. You don't get to go to the powwow instead. It's seriously that fundamental. Allow Indigenous peoples to govern themselves. We certainly can't do a worse job than what's been done so far. And I honestly believe we can do it, or I wouldn't be up here talking to you today. We, unfortunately, have lived in an unbalanced relationship for too long, and it's time to give back. It's time to share. We have always kept the peace. We have always lived up to our treaty agreements. When we got angry and wanted to hurt somebody, we hurt ourselves. Canadians have nothing to fear. They've never had anything to fear from Indigenous peoples. Because whenever anything goes wrong in this country, whether it was Harper's threat to democracy or a company's threat to clean water, who are the first people on the front lines? Indigenous peoples. Standing beside you, defending your democracy, your human rights, your equality rights, and the water that we have to share to live. Now, given the amount of strength and resilience and hope and peace that Indigenous peoples have brought to the table since contact, if I was looking for a partner in a war, not that I'm advocating war, it would be us. It would be us. And people like David Suzuki have said, it's not going to be environmentalists that save the world. It's going to be Indigenous peoples. Because Indigenous peoples come from the land, they're willing to die for the land, and that's something that you can't buy. You're lucky. Your Indigenous neighbors are there to protect you. You couldn't ask for anything better. Your future is set as long as you do your part and stand up and protect us. Because at the end of the day, reconciliation is not about cultural awareness training. Sorry, consultants. But that's not going to cut it. It's substantive. So let's do this. Let's embrace the conflict. Let's get uncomfortable and start this healing journey together, because it hasn't started. It hasn't started. But imagine the force we will be together. Indigenous peoples have this incredible shield of resilience and willing to die for this territory. They have Indigenous and treaty rights that protect these lands. But settlers are the sword. They have the numbers, the power, the wealth, the influence. Imagine if we put that shield and sword together. We would literally be undefeatable. We could take over Trump land. So, we need you, because we need to devote our efforts back to revitalizing our nations, revitalizing our cultures, and healing our people. Our focus shouldn't be on trying to defend our existence and our right to live. It shouldn't be trying to hide our children from doctors and nurses and child and family services. Help us and we can help you. And I know everyone in this room can do that. Your roles as allies are so important. The fact that you're all here gives me hope. When I first started out doing this, 10 people would show up and they'd all be rolling their eyes. When I first started teaching, I had just a handful of students and they were all rolling their eyes. Now, my classes are waiting list only, and people's number one question is, what can I do? Change is coming. Don't rely on the government to do it. You need to push them to do it. They're a little on the lazy side sometimes. So let's go forward. Let's use all of our successes that we've had, all of the good things that we have together, and inspire other people to join us at the risk of being successful and making this radical change. Come on, I know you're all risk takers. What do we have to lose by trying this? What we can do is prevent Canada from sliding backwards into the darkness of racism, and we can move forward and get us out. Because if we can do this amongst one another, if we can repair this treaty relationship, then we also have a chance at saving the planet, which, by the way, asked me the other day for some truth, justice, and reconciliation. So thank you for listening to me, and I am confident that we can do this together. Thank you.
We have some time now for questions. It's going to be a limited time. I'm going to watch the clock. When it reaches 8:30, that will be the last questioner. So that will be your cue if you're still standing in line to go and take a seat. So please line up at these mics here to ask your questions. We will take alternating sides. I ask, please, that you ask questions. We've already had our lecture tonight. This is your opportunity to ask questions. Pam tells me that she's too kind to cut people off, but I'm not. So please respect those waiting in line behind you. We have limited time. Be quick, thanks. We'll start here.
Thanks for attending. I actually enjoyed your lecture. When the Boushie trial came down right now, actually Margaret Trudeau was standing right where you are, and I was standing right there, and I actually got a notification that it a non-guilty verdict. And when it came down, I honestly believed that Regina, Saskatoon, and perhaps North Battleford were going to become another Ferguson. What was actually being done to exercise such restraint that prevented that from actually happening?
It's not our inclination. I know some people believe it's our inclination, that when bad things happen to us, we're going to react with violence. But if you look at everything that's happened in our history, what we've done is try to raise hope at a time when there's the least amount of hope. So the second that we saw the family speak in the media about justice for their son, and they stood there with strength and hope and resilience, that was a strong signal to the rest of us that our job was just to wrap our arms around that family. And that's our inclination every time. It makes us angry, it makes us hurt, but I have never known anyone who's expressed an intention to want to hurt somebody back, because we don't do that, we hurt ourselves.
Hi. So there's a few of us fourth-year education students here, and I wanted to know, do you have any tips for us about teaching Indigenous content and things that we can do in a classroom to help?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not in education, I'm in law and politics, surprise, surprise. So someone ask me a Trudeau question, please, someone ask me a Trudeau question. But keep it current. I think the biggest problem that I've seen across faculties is that when they do indigenize their courses, it's historicized. Keep it current. We're in the here and now. So if you're talking about education, well, what is the impact of foster care on Indigenous kids? You know, they get less of an education, and how do we deal with that? How do we teach kids who are suffering because they're in foster care and they're coming to school bruised and broken and walking wounded? We have to deal with all aspects of Indigenous education, not just pedagogy, but actually the human beings that are before us. And so anytime you can bring reality into the classroom as a teaching moment, I think we should.
Thank you.
Hello. I had a question about land claims. It seems to me that the land claim process is almost a second go-around, where they're saying, okay, this is it. Canada's been sold. There's no coming back from this. Like, does that, like, I mean, you are clearly more educated than I am, but is that a reflection of reality?
Are you asking for free legal advice? I'm just kidding. No,
too late,
you know what?
Too late for that.
That's actually a really important question, because there's a lot of problems around land claims. And this talk around, we have to reconcile rights. Excuse me, the reconciliation happened when we signed those treaties. You've asked us to make sacrifices, and now you're saying, oh, well, we want you to sacrifice again. Well, and take less and take less and take less. Why? The only reason is because we want more and we want more and we want more. And so we are the ones who are responsible to withdraw from those processes. So for land claims, when I work with First Nations, the first thing I say is, I don't care if it's a small specific land claim for 1 acre of land, if it's for 10 acres of land, or if it's for a part of road. Under no condition do you surrender your title to those lands. You can take compensation, you can make any other agreement, but never surrender an acre for any amount of money. Because what Canada's trying to do is go around the country and buy its sovereignty, because it doesn't have it.
Given what you have said, then my question is basically straightforward. Where do you seriously, I'm going to follow with something about what is history, but where do you seriously see the character of the Canadian state and Canadian society? This part is somewhat known, but not that broadly. Canada has a relationship, a historic relationship with South Africa and laying the foundations of apartheid. That has been brought out, all right? Some of the actors in the early treaties of Western Canada went to South Africa and signed treaty with the Africans and set up the structures of segregation, formalizing the Bantu stands, the reserve system, and so on and so forth, all right?
Ron, is this coming to a question soon?
My question was at the beginning. What is the care? You're not paying attention. You're back in your office. All right. The real character. I have apprehensions, as you said at the end, of slipping back into the darkness of racism. That's what scares me today, you know. There was a Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa. And apartheid was overthrown. South Africans made numerous trips to Canada to study the system of segregation that went on here, including residential schools. Here's a hardly known fact. In the early 1880s, previous to the insurrection at Batoche and Cut Knife Hill, the Germans sent a special emissary to Canada
Ron, I'm going to have to
to
stop
look
you there. Ron,
at...
this is a lecture now, okay? I'm going to have to
No,
stop
but
you there.
I'm saying
Can
the
you repeat the question?
What is the character of the Canadian state and Canadian society for change?
Thank you.
I believe we can make the change. I don't think it's going to come from the state. I don't think it's going to be government-led. Oh my goodness, I hope it is not a government initiative. It's the people who do it every time. How did we get women's equality rights? It's women protesting on the streets and suing people in court. How do we get human rights? You have to fight for these things, and Canadians are going to have to fight for truth, justice, and reconciliation alongside of Indigenous peoples. I believe the people can do it. The real government is the people, and I believe they can do it.
Well, I hope my question will follow up on that nicely. I really agreed with what you said about the cultural awareness programming is not going to cut it. And especially the mandatory ones where the people who are going into these rooms don't want to hear it or are being forced to learn the history. So I have a passion for working with our white allies, a passion and a patience for it. So my question for you is, what do you feel at this moment is the most effective approach? Or what is it you're hearing from allies, non-Indigenous allies, white allies? What are you hearing besides what can we do? What are some of the more tactical issues to address here? I've got my own ideas on that, but I'm asking what yours are.
That's a good question. I think the most important thing that Canadians can do first is self-educate. We can't even really have this conversation if I have to teach, because then we're not in the reconciliation process. I'm now giving back again. There's got to be some level of self-education, and the vast majority of us have the ability, the wealth, the access to be able to access information. Just follow me on Twitter and it'll be all good. But, you know, and then once you're there, sometimes people will say, well, it's too overwhelming. Like, how do I fix it all? Pick something. Go to Cindy Blackstock's website, the First Nation Child and Family Caring Society, sign her free petition, write those free letters to senators and MPs, and make a donation if you can to her ongoing court case to defend the rights of First Nations people. Easy chunk. And then go from there. And before, and the other thing I'll say, because I had this conversation earlier, before you come to Native people and say, what can we do? You need to say, what do you have to offer? Is it money that you're offering? Is it time? Is it research? Is it legal advice? Is it a supporting hand? Are you babysitting our kids so we can go to a rally? What do you have to offer? And that way we don't have to be guessing. And I think we'll be good.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you very much for this evening's lecture. It's funny because my question was slightly related. I have the privilege of working on several reserves around Regina. Obviously, I'm not Canadian. I come from the Caribbean. And so I came here with absolutely no knowledge, which has been a help and a hindrance. But one of the things is, I don't even quite know all the questions I want to ask. And sometimes, even though I have a good relationship, and I class a lot of people as friends, although you said that's not reconciliation, I quite like having lots of friends. I'm even slightly afraid to ask some of the questions that come into my head. And one of the worst things humans do anywhere is not have conversations, because the answers without the conversations are usually untrue and worse than the conversation. So how do we, at an individual level, forget government level, forget provincial level, at an individual level, how do we make the conversations normal instead of forced, or, as you said, you have to go to this lecture to understand cultural awareness? And I freely accept, when I came to Canada, I was given a 20-minute cultural awareness lecture, and it possibly was the worst lecture I've ever heard in my life. And I didn't understand it, so I assumed it was because I wasn't Canadian. But my wife, who is Canadian, said, no, that was the worst lecture you've ever heard. So my question is, how do we make the conversations normal?
Okay, so you have to enter that conversation in a spirit of reconciliation. So have you done, based on your level, your experience, your abilities, the required amount of self-education yet? Do you know enough to have the right conversation? Because if you do, then you can have a conversation that's based in respect and that you've done some of the work. You've showed the other person that you've done some of the work. And there are different ways to ask questions. You can say, hey, how come all chiefs are millionaires? Good grief, I hear this all the time. Or you can say, hey, the media just reported that, chiefs are all crooked and millionaires. Is that true? Is there any basis in reality? And then the response you would get is, well, no, in fact, when we did the research, there's never been a millionaire chief in the history of this country. That's just a Harper lie. And it's all how you approach it. Now, in my classroom, it's a little different. I am in a place where I can offer to the students, ask me anything, anytime. I know you don't know anything yet. Don't worry about offending me. Not every Indigenous person is in that place because of their background, so don't presume that. But if you've done a substantive amount of self-education, then I think you come to the conversation with some level of respect.
I'm working on it. It's a long journey. I'm sorry. I've only been here 18 months, and I'm working on it, and I'm getting better. But I also get embarrassed when I think of some of the questions I have. And I also, all we hear about now is fake news, and I don't know what's true and what's not sometimes. Like
I said, follow me on Twitter.
I'm quite old. I don't use Twitter.
Obviously, you're familiar with the climate right now with the Colton Boushie case. A lot of my white allies and a lot of I don't know how to say this, educated First Nations people that have had the opportunity to go back to university, how do we handle these people that are obviously hurt? A racist isn't someone who's just mad at us, they're a hurt person. How do we communicate to these people effectively?
I think you have to use your energy and skills and heart, mind, and spirit strategically. That's just my opinion. Everybody's got their own opinion. So where do I want to put the bulk of my effort? So the bulk of my effort is empowering and educating and rebuilding our nations. Then there's a smaller part of my effort that goes towards also helping to educate and empower our allies. I waste zero time on online trolls, white supremacist groups, or hate groups. I will not lift them up and give them a platform.
family.
And that being said, I know that sometimes we have friends who are experiencing these issues for the first time and might say something racist and hurtful out of ignorance or because that's how they were raised. And if they're a friend, then I say engage them on that and just ask the questions. Well, what makes you think that all chiefs are crooked? And have that conversation and just, you can never lose a conversation if it's always fact-based. And so I keep all conversations fact-based, and I have never lost a debate with the Canadian Taxpayers Federation on that basis alone.
Thank you.
Good evening. I am an immigrant and I just recently became a Canadian. So I guess my question is, thank you very much. I guess my question is, what do you think is our role to the reconciliation to be a more positive ally to the Indigenous people?
Your role is the exact same. You're here now, you're in this beautiful imperfect mess. You benefit from everything that Canada has to offer now, so your responsibility is the same as someone who's been here for 4 generations. Self-educate, stand behind Indigenous peoples, and commit to truth, justice, and reconciliation.
Thank you very much. May I a follow-up question? What can you say to the newcomers who thinks that they don't have something to do with the, like what happened in the past for the Canadian?
Give them my phone number.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Russell Paskiman, Nitsiga, Sun Red Pheasant Uchinia. My name is Russell Paskiman. I'm a master's student thesis. I come from Red Pheasant. That's where I grew up. And I survived all of the systemic things that were against me. And I'm a father of 9 children. I've been dancing powwow for 28 years and singing powwow for that long. I attend our ceremonies, and I was Scapewis and helper here in around Regina. And my Colton was my cousin. Yeah. And when we heard the not guilty verdict, it felt as though he passed away again. My question for you is, what can we all do? And I'm not Indigenous. I'm not Indian. I'm not a savage. I'm Nehiawak. I'm a Cree person, human. And my question is, how can we make it better for our Indigenous Nehiawak youth to make it in this world off of those colonial borders, dealing with meritocracy, hegemony. I work in a classroom at Sheldon Williams Collegiate. I'm the first, you would say, Indigenous male teacher to walk those halls since the school opened in 1956. I'm doing my best to pave the way for more to come. And it's been a huge battle to get to this spot. And, what can we all do as a society to make it better for our children and the children's children, the unborn?
My best advice is the advice that I have 8 sisters and 3 brothers, and they're all crazy radicals. My best advice is what they gave me, and they said, no matter how hard it is, no matter how hopeless it seems, no matter how many obstacles are in our way, and no matter how unfair it is that we have yet another burden to bear, we must raise our children as warriors. Warriors of mind, spirit, body. And that doesn't, for all you settlers out there, that doesn't mean violence. Warriors are honorable. They're caretakers and defenders. They're lovers and protectors. And that's the only advice I have been following my whole life, is how to live life like a warrior and defend our people. And that's all I have to offer, and I'm so sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
Emily, and this person will be the last question.
This is a question actually for a friend. It really is. She had to go home and feed her baby. She is going to inherit some land. She's a descendant of settlers. She is a settler. And she would like to do something in terms of giving it back to, it's in just outside of Calgary. I think that's, and she wants to know in a very practical way who exactly she should approach about giving it back. So the specific question is around should, for example, band councils, which are colonial creations, would that be the appropriate way in, I guess?
That's a good question, because I do think we have to start giving back, and there are more painful ways to give back and less painful ways to give back. One of the less painful ways to give back is actually by leaving land in a will, leaving property in a will, for example. When corporations no longer need land, instead of selling it, they can give it back. I think that person should, wherever that land is located, should talk to the local First Nation. And I know we've all been colonized. There's no one in this room who hasn't been a victim of colonization. Indigenous people's the worst. But chiefs and councillors are our people. Ask any one of them if they have an actual choice about whether to be under the Indian Act governing system or not. Because there have been a couple of First Nations who have said, screw you, we're not going to do it. Every single funding portfolio was cut off, and there was no food, education, water, health care. So it's not like band councils have a choice. They're forced, chiefs and councillors are forced into an impossible scenario. They have to live by the Indian Act. They have no choice but to dance to the tune of the minister to get the money to feed their people. But because it's a colonial construct, they bear the burden of that. So please never not go to the local chief and council, many of whom work with committees of elders, committees of youth, committees of community members, and say, how do we give this land back? And maybe they can do it in a ceremony. Maybe there can be a celebration. Maybe there's so many good things that can come of that. But please, anybody in this audience, remember that chief and councillors are people too, and they have suffered all of the same stuff, and it's an impossible job, and they would be more than happy to be able to do something like that.
It's hard not to be emotional. Since the verdict, I've been a mess. My name is Chastity Delorme. I'm from here, Treaty 4 Territory. Cowes First Nation, our original name is Cahesis, but because of colonial contact, it looks nothing like our original name. I guess I have not so much a question, but maybe some help from you as we're closing off the night, and to support my friend Russell and a few other of my people that have been up here. I too am an advocate in a local high school, and I do my best to create space and opportunity for Indigenous students to learn their cultural identity. The hardest part is doing that while not being tokenized, while teaching my allies what it's really like to be a Cree person in this territory, and not just about pictures hanging on the walls and naming our rooms, which we often see too many times. It's always us against them when we're working in organizations, crown corporations, government. And the most difficult part of that is expressing our indigeneity. And when you're in a room full of white people and you're the only Indigenous person, how do we get our voice heard, genuinely heard, without being a token? And I feel like I'm a bridge builder in my community, so I create and I help these opportunities between our Indigenous community and our non-Indigenous community. And just like Michelle said earlier, I have the patience and understanding to do that. And that takes a lot of work and a lot of prayer and a lot of forgiveness. So with someone like you, I could only imagine being where you are and being able to share your words and your inspiration to a room full of almost all non-Indigenous people. I would just like your help and share some words of inspiration to all the non-Indigenous people in the room as to how they can better listen to each and every Indigenous person in their workplace, in their classroom, their colleagues, and support them genuinely, and no more being tokens in these spaces. Thank you.
So yet another burden that Indigenous peoples have had to bear for a long time. Speaking out, trying to educate, trying to build bridges in all different phases of our history. And under Harper, that wasn't a very welcome phase, for example. So there's times when it's better and times when it's not. It is difficult when you are the only one in the room. The first thing I did was I scanned the room and I looked for my kukum over here. And I was like, okay, I am gonna go see my kukum, she's my protector, I'm good. I'm good. Find whether it's your bundle of medicine that you keep with you for strength, whether it's the kukum in the room, whether you go back and do something for yourself, or you call someone and rage on the phone about what just happened and someone asks some ridiculous question. And we've got to be in this together. We can't carry the burden alone. And sometimes because we go, we think we're just doing this alone. And I think it's okay to ask people to listen respectfully. It's okay to say, listen, I don't know, employer A, before you get to the stage where you have cultural awareness training, and you get to hear about the beauty of our culture and our traditions and our ceremonies, before you qualify for that, because that's the prize at the end. Before you get there, you need Canada 101 training. You need human rights training. You need Indigenous peoples right now training. And once you're good with that, then we can go to the prize at the end. And that doesn't just apply to employers and when you're trying to give speaking in schools. Every time a police officer murders one of our Indigenous women or men and there's an inquiry, the first recommendation is, oh, these police need cultural awareness training. And no, they don't. No, they don't qualify for it. They don't deserve it. What they need is how not to kill people who are unarmed, how not to murder Native people, how not to be racist, how not to be sexually violent. And once you've learned all of those things, and you work with us as humans, then you get the prize of our culture, but not beforehand.
As we conclude, I would like to thank Dr. Pam Palmater for tonight's presentation of the Woodrow Lloyd Lecture. She has provided a crucial perspective on the fundamental changes that must occur if Canada is to move forward from a place of institutional colonialism. In the hopes of furthering this message, please note that a recording of this lecture will shortly be available on the Faculty of Arts website and social media. I hope you will consider sharing it with interested friends and allies. I must say a quick thank you to the many people who have contributed to the success of tonight's event. Our gratitude goes to the Woodrow Lloyd Trust Fund for making this series possible. I would also like to acknowledge the efforts of the Woodrow Lloyd Lecture Committee, including Claire Polster, Jeff Lux, Florence Stratton, and myself, supported by the efforts of Milagros Cherries and Caravanseed. Finally, I thank you all for coming and would like to invite you all to join us for refreshments in the lobby outside. Good night.
Thank you.